Hey, guess what? We're about to have a merry time because today we're going to be talking about maritime empires. We're going to be looking at how they're established. It's going to be over a couple of different videos. This is going to be the first one. So, what we need to talk about here is going to be the labor system. So, we are going to start talking about the Atlantic slave trade and what effect that had. So, in this maritime trade period, not everybody was having a merry time there. In fact, it was brutal. In fact, it was worse than probably any of us could even imagine. The worst case scenario for the Atlantic slave trade was probably 100 times worse. So let's start with what was causing that. Okay, after Columbus and as the Europeans were starting to populate and colonize into the New World, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and eventually the English started to need labor forces. It was an agriculturally based economies that they were looking at. So because of the great dying of the Native Americans due to measles, smallpox that was spread to them by the Europeans, there was a need for a labor force to work the different agricultural systems in the New World. And so the Spanish thought, hey, African slaves would be great because we've already traded with them and they are not susceptible to the diseases that we are carrying. When we think about the Atlantic slave trade, a lot of times we think about the English first from this historical point of view, but really the Portuguese got the ball rolling. And honestly, the amount of slaves that went into what would be South America, Brazil, was a massive amount. But the English started to pick that up as their colonies grew in the New World after 1607. And not just the North American colonies, but those, when we call the Southern colonies, it's also those holdings down in the Caribbean. So ship captains would load their ships up, pile people that were of African descent from Western Africa on top of each other. A lot of them were shackled, all right, except for the women and children. They had a little more freedom. And then once they piled them in, there were no facilities. So they would have excrement and relieve themselves of right where they were, leading to awful, terrible disease. Sometimes this disease killed the actual people on board or would make others sick. Now, the slaves that were getting sick, that meant they were less value to the final location in the New World. They were seen as cargo. They were seen as nothing different than even a luxury item, say like a piece of china, a porcelain, right? And here's the thing. If you have stuff on board and something breaks or you lose it on sea, they have insurance to cover it. So there are accounts of slave ships that actually had sick slaves that were pushed overboard. And because if they were lost at sea or drowned, then they could at least recover the money from the insurance. This led to about 12 million slaves that were moving over through the Atlantic slave trade. But what nobody really talks about is the 1.8 million that were lost in death along the way. Now, slavery was driven by these cash crops like tobacco and sugar and cotton. They needed very intense labor forces to be able to create those products that was creating great wealth. And it reminds me of a trip to a museum when I went to Charleston, South Carolina here recently. I overheard a gentleman talking about his conversation with one of the people that worked in there, and they were talking about the industry of the slave trade. And that's the thing. It was an industry. It was just a way to make money, and people were going to be drawn into that. They didn't take in the morality of it. It was a transaction. And I will never forget what this guy said as I overheard his conversation with his wife. There's a partition between us in this museum where the slave auctions would occur. And he is talking so I can hear him, but I can't see him and he can't see me. And as he's talking about the process of, enslaved Africans, right? Whether they were prisoners of war or they were captured by Europeans and bought and sold and then taken to the Americas, and the conditions that they were under and how they were treated. His response was, what an effed up industry. And that's the thing. We have to remember this was an industry people saw it as a way to make money. Forget about the morality. That comes later with the abolition movements. But I want to give a little context going forward, because these slave traders that ended up and made great wealth during this time period, right, 1450 to 1750, those at the later end of the time period are very interesting people. The reason why they're interesting is because at that 1750, there's this little thing going on in England that occurs because of this growth of technology, and that is the first industrial revolution. They need labor. So the industrialists, where did they come from? How did they have the money to start the factory systems that would eventually drive the textile industry that would make Great Britain so filthy rich? Why, those capitalists made their money from the slave trade. And now you know your freaking history. Peace.